Thanks for continuing on with us. My name is Ibrahim Sani, taking over from my colleague Najib Aruf. We're looking at cost of living being part and parcel of the idea of Budget 2023. In fact, one could argue that that is the central tenet of the whole budget even. Joining us on the line is Professor Dr. Jeffrey Williams, the Economic Professor of the Malaysia University of Science and Technology. Jeffrey, let's talk a little bit more about the idea of tackling cost of living. My understanding is that you might have a differing view from that of the World Bank economist. Maybe we can share with us some of your ideas on how to tackle cost of living in the context of Budget 23.
Okay, well, I think that the issue with the cost of living now has changed to how we've been dealing with it over the course of the last couple of years. In particular, there is a question of the price controls and the subsidies. My view is that these have worked in the short term, but of course, in the long term, when you have price controls and subsidies, they start to cause distortions in the market, and they're also very, very expensive. So what we need to do now is to move away from dealing with cost of living issues just in terms of controlling prices or even controlling inflation, and to look at the effect of the affordability of products and services, and that means looking at the question of income. So we've had quite a period of inflation, and that means that prices have gone up, not just for food, which of course is a big concern for many people, but prices have gone up across the board. Now, these prices are not going to come down very quickly. We say that prices are downward sticky. That is to say, they go up quickly, but they don't come down quickly. So even if inflation slows, and we expect that it's definitely going to slow during this year, we expect that it might fall to 2.5%, for example, by the middle of the year, and then a little bit lower after that. Even though inflation will be slowing, prices will still be high, and that's a question of cost of living because it's an affordability issue. And the reason why these higher prices are unaffordable is not just because the price is high or because we have inflation, it's because of income. So the way to deal with this now is to look at subsidizing incomes, not subsidizing prices.
Okay, what is interesting also is that Bank Negara issued a public statement saying that headline inflation has averaged 3.4% for the period of January to November last year. As projected, headline inflation does peak in the third quarter of last year, while underlying inflation as measured by core inflation has averaged about 2.9% up to November 22. We're looking at December headlines not seeing any much different from the rest of fourth quarter. And you're right, while food inflation is indeed one of the highest in terms of category of inflation, we are also looking at the government having no more money to subsidize either food or even petrol. How do you think the government is going to manage this whole idea of rising inflation rates, particularly food, with little to no money left to continue to pay for high subsidies?
Well, I'm not sure that they have little to no money left. But, I mean, it is true that during last year, the subsidy bill was extremely high, anything above 80 billion. But a great deal of that was spent on petrol, as we know. And fortunately, Malaysia was able to afford that because when oil prices are high, Petronas has higher revenue. That higher revenue goes to the government. So the royalty from Petronas to the government doubled during last year. But unfortunately, that was used for subsidizing petrol rather than for priority areas like health, education, social infrastructure, and investment. Now, we would expect that the subsidy bill will fall because oil prices have fallen quite considerably from where they were last year at around $120 down to about $80 at the moment. And that should reduce the overall subsidy bill. We also know that within the current budget in 2023 as compared to 2022, there are a lot of opportunities to reprioritize spending and to change the overall spending profile. So, for example, the government introduced the assistance scheme in January. They brought forward the assistance scheme in January for the B40 group. That cost 1.67 billion ringgit. If they were to have the same assistance scheme every month for the whole of 12 months, for the whole of the year, for example, it would cost 20 billion. And that's only 1/4 of the amount of money that they were spending on subsidies in 2022. So it is expensive, but it's not as expensive as the existing subsidy scheme, and it can be afforded recorded within the current budget because of reallocation. We also have to remember that many of the things the government was spending on last year, such as some of the COVID interventions, they've gone away for this year. So there is a saving to be made.
Dr. Jeffrey, we're looking at fuel subsidy bill. 48% is for petrol, 15%, 1/5, is for cash transfers, 18% is for cooking oil and other consumption subsidies, including chicken, eggs, etc. The remaining about 19% is for other subsidies. Because of this, do you feel that the idea of targeted subsidies, while that has always been the agenda of not just this administration, but the administration of before as well, is extremely hard to be introduced, and therefore perhaps direct cash aid is better?
Absolutely, I agree with that. I mean, in that list that you just gave to us, one of the big concerns, of course, is the food subsidies, the oil subsidy, chicken subsidy, price controls on chicken and eggs and all of this. Because we've had all of that, we're now seeing market distortion. Those market distortions have to be addressed, because if they go on, it's just going to make things worse. The problem with having price controls and subsidies on cooking oil and eggs and basic food items, for example, is you can't exclude the T40 or the T20 or the M40, the higher income groups, in other words. You can't exclude them from buying those subsidized products. It's just physically and feasibly not possible to do that. So actually, those subsidies are not targeted on the low-income groups. So if you simply stopped subsidizing those products, use that money as part of a cash transfer scheme, you can transfer the money directly to the low-income groups, and then they can choose to spend that as they wish. Of course, we have to do that in a measured way, because when you remove the price controls and the subsidies, the prices of eggs and chicken and cooking oil will rise according to the market rate. But because people's income will also be assisted through a redistribution of money, then they should be able to afford to accommodate those extra price increases. And they can choose what they're spending the money on. And that's really quite important in my view, because it means that they can make the choices across whatever food types, whatever shops they want to buy, and when and where and how they want to get. And that's the benefit, I think, of the cash transfer as opposed to the price control.
One idea also has been noted. For instance, the World Bank has reported that completely removing fuel subsidies is likely to cause a 9% increase in consumer prices, whereas the effect on producer prices and GDP deflator is likely to be relatively lower, with producer prices at about 8.2%. The GDP deflator is at 6.78%. In short, the price impact of the subsidy removal, if any, is not uniform across sectors. And if we balance this with direct cash aid, hypothetically speaking, do you feel that we're looking at a bigger amount of direct cash aid that needs to be transferred to cushion the impact of subsidy removal, price increase realizing from subsidy removal?
Well, I'm not convinced by the analysis which says that we're going to see these massive price increases. And also in the question of petrol subsidies, you have to remember that we haven't just introduced petrol subsidies. Petrol prices have been subsidized for the longest period of time. So they're looking at the petrol costs and the fuel costs more generally, I think is a little bit misleading. If we focus it on the food price controls and the food subsidies in particular, and also things such as electricity costs, for example, utilities costs, then I don't think that you would have that massive increase in inflation. But there is definitely going to be an inflationary impact, but it's not going to be anywhere close to what the numbers that you've just been suggesting.
Because of this, what would be some of your wish list, Jeffrey, in terms of this budget? What would be some of the ideas that you wish, if you are the finance minister, for instance, to be included in this budget?
Well, I wish that there isn't going to be a long laundry list of handouts. That's the first thing. I wish that the government will focus very much more on structural reform to help people deal with cost of living, not just for people on the lowest income groups, but people in the middle income groups who are also struggling with cost of living. And I hope that the government will focus very much more on these issues of wastage in spending and also in improving the efficiency of collection in
Before we conclude our conversation this morning, Jeffrey, I want to ask you about the income side of things. The Finance Minister / Prime Minister, Dr. Sri Ibrahim, has said that GST might not necessarily be introduced in the near term. In fact, he's not postulating that it's going to be introduced in the midterm. So there is also that whole problem of raising funds to fund this budget. Yes, I agree with you that improving collection has to be improved in terms of efficiency. Leakages also has to be managed well, particularly with corruption cases that is pending, and perhaps MACC and the other informed bodies can actually improve on the corruption cases. But still, generally speaking, income is a big problem. So what's next for the government on this front?
Yes, I agree that income is a big problem. Revenue as a whole for the government is a big problem. But my preference is that any question about GST or income tax increases or business tax changes should be done as part of a holistic reform of revenue, not just ad hoc increases. We have to remember that GST is a very regressive tax, and people on low incomes pay GST every bit as much as people on high income. And so simply to suggest that GST is the solution, in my view, is not correct. It will be part of the solution, but it's not going to be the whole of the solution. This is why I think it's very important to focus on structural reform. And I agree absolutely with what you're suggesting, which is that that's got to be a priority. So if the Prime Minister were to announce that the review of taxes and revenues would be front and center in terms of his budget, I think that would be a very good thing, a very good signal for us.
On top of other structural reforms that you think that the government must do and must undertake right now, we have had one speaker on this show, Aurobindo Ponia from PwC, arguing that our tax code is indeed old, if not outdated. We're looking at the income tax 1967 demanding to be revamped and updated. Do you agree with these kind of sentiments?
Yes, I do. And because I think that type of observation from people who are tax experts at a very forensic level is really important in terms of the whole or the holistic review of the entire system. Because it very much is a question of looking at line by line in the tax code. And removing some of the things which are out of date, and also introducing some new things. For example, taxing e-commerce. How do we do that? Taxing digital in the digital space. How is that being done? And to make sure that it's all reevaluated, or not just from a macroeconomic level, but also from a forensic level. So I wholly agree with these observations from people who are very much more in tune with the details of tax accounting than I am as a macroeconomist, but certainly I'm pretty confident that they can uncover a lot of very good reforms that can improve the efficiency of the overall system. And when you do that, actually, you do have the prospect of raising revenue, because when the system is more efficient, your collection process is improving.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. That was Professor Dr. Jeffrey Williams of the Malaysia University of Science and Technology. Have a good day, Dr. Jeffrey. And of course, I'm very concerned about the political element as well to all this.